Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. So, brothers and sisters, the conflict between Palestinians and the Zionist state on the eastern Mediterranean has broken out again in a very large way that has certainly the attention of the Muslims and many others right now. For one, I used to study this conflict very, very intensely back when I was pursuing my degree in political science, but that was about 18 years ago now. And I eventually left really studying that conflict as well as the other conflicts that take place in the Muslim world. In one part because I found studying Islam that really it called more to focus on things that are within one's control as opposed to things that are out of one's control. And I do think that an over focus for someone in the West on the political situations in the Muslim world can be a bit of a self-defeating trap to get into. And also, too, I really believe that whether or not it's the issues in the Muslim world or issues that Muslims face domestically in the West, at the end of the day, educating people about Islam more and people in the West who often have power and control over Muslims, whether it is the governments in the Muslim world or it is the environments that we live in the West, educating them more about Islam, I at the end of the day, believe that that is the key to Muslims having more freedom, and particularly the freedom and ability to practice their religion more. So from that, what really interests me more about these conflicts is the sort of propaganda battle that takes place in various channels of media and how that affects Muslims' ability to interact with non-Muslims and their ability in particular to educate them about Islam and what it means to be Muslim. I've said many times on this channel that one of the challenges that Muslims face that you have to be very conscious of is it's not really fair for Muslims, and it's not the best way or even really a legitimate way to educate someone about Islam starting from a area of conflict, whether it is a macro level conflict or a micro level conflict. So the political situations are macro level. Things like your coworker inviting you to a happy hour, that might be a micro level thing. One way or the other, you have to find ways and you have to think about how you call people to a platform where they can learn in a more foundational way about Islam in a manner that is authentic, in a manner that relates to people and how they live their everyday lives. So, it's almost impressive how intense people's emotions get over this conflict in particular. And to reflect on that a little bit and to read about that a little bit, and for the Muslims to understand things about the mentality of Westerners, and for the Westerners themselves who follow this channel, for them to reflect upon themselves or their brethren a little bit more, I want to read a part from the book The Road to Mecca by Muhammad Asad. May Allah have mercy on him. Muhammad Asad is an Austrian man, originally born by the name Leopold Weiss, and he was from a Jewish family, and he was a journalist in Palestine as well as elsewhere in the Muslim world, and he ended up accepting Islam, and he had many ventures throughout the Muslim world, in Saudi Arabia, in Libya, and eventually Pakistan. In the beginning of this book, he tells his life story, and it starts off in the United Nations because he was in the United Nations visiting it as a diplomat for the country of Pakistan in the post-partition era. And he was there as a practicing Muslim, and he talks about how the Western diplomats were very, very shocked by that he was clearly a Western-looking man who was practicing Islam, and they wanted to know what that was all about. So he starts into a conversation with another diplomat about that and about the West's general mentality towards Islam and towards Muslims when they look at it. Now, this was written and published in the early 1950s. So when listening to something being read, and I advise all of you to read more in this media-driven area, we are all consuming too much media. Reading can be very nice because it can, one, slow our brains down with the way that we consume the medium, but it also is very efficiently packed with information when you read. So sometimes when you're listening to it, you have to pay close attention to make sure you're getting everything. And there is a lot to get out of this that I will draw some further lessons from that we can take. He says, quote, "When a Westerner discusses, say, Hinduism or Buddhism, he is always conscious of the fundamental differences between these ideologies and his own. He may admire this or that of their ideas, but would naturally never consider the possibility of substituting them for his own. Because he a priori admits this impossibility, he is able to contemplate such really alien cultures with equanimity and often with sympathetic appreciation." And equanimity means like mental calmness and clear-headedness. But when it comes to Islam, which is by no means as alien to Western values as Hindu or Buddhist philosophy, this Western equanimity is almost invariably disturbed by an emotional bias. It is perhaps, I sometimes wonder, because the values of Islam are close enough to those of the West to constitute a potential challenge to many Western concepts of spiritual and social life. And I went on to tell him of a theory which I had conceived some years ago, a theory that might perhaps help one to understand better the deep-seated prejudice against Islam so often to be found in Western literature and contemporary thought. To find a truly convincing explanation of this prejudice, I said, one has to look far backward into history and try to comprehend the psychological background of the earliest relations between the Western and the Muslim worlds. What Occidentals, meaning Westerners, think and feel about Islam today is rooted in impressions that were born during the Crusades. "The Crusades," exclaimed my friend. "You don't mean to say that what happened nearly 1,000 years ago could still have an effect on people of the 20th century?" "Oh, but it does. I know it sounds incredible. But don't you remember the incredulity which greeted the early discoveries of the psychoanalysts when they tried to show that much of the emotional life of a mature person, and most of those seemingly unaccountable leanings, tastes, and prejudices comprised in the term idiosyncrasies, can be traced back to the experiences of his most formative age, his early childhood? Well, are nations and civilizations anything but collective individuals? Their development also is bound up with the experiences of their early childhood. As with children, those experiences may have been pleasant or unpleasant. They may have been perfectly rational or, alternatively, due to the child's naive misinterpretation of an event. The molding effect of every such experience depends primarily on its original intensity. The century immediately preceding the Crusades, that is, the end of the first millennium of the Christian era, might well be described as the early childhood of Western civilization. I proceeded to remind my friend, himself a historian, that this had been the age when, for the first time since the dark centuries that followed the breakup of imperial Rome, Europe was beginning to see its own cultural way, independently of the almost forgotten Roman heritage. New literatures were just then coming into existence in the European vernaculars, inspired by the religious experience of Western Christianity. Fine arts were slowly awakening from the lethargy caused by the warlike migrations of the Goths and Huns. Out of the crude conditions of the early Middle Ages, a new cultural world was emerging. It was at that crucial, extremely sensitive stage of its development that Europe received its most formidable shock. In modern parlance, a trauma in the shape of the Crusades. The Crusades were the strongest collective impression on a civilization that had just begun to be conscious of itself. Historically speaking, they represented Europe's earliest and entirely successful attempt to view itself under the aspect of cultural unity. Nothing that Europe has experienced before or after could compare with the enthusiasm which the First Crusade brought into being. A wave of intoxication swept over the continent, an elation which for the first time overstepped the barriers between states and tribes and classes. Before then, there had been Franks and Saxons and Germans, Burgundians and Sicilians, Normans and Lombards, a medley of tribes and races with scarcely anything in common but the fact that most of their feudal kingdoms and principalities were remnants of the Roman Empire and that all of them professed the Christian faith. But in the Crusades and through them, the religious bond was elevated to a new plane, a cause common to all Europeans alike, the political religious concept of Christendom, which in its turn gave birth to the cultural concept of Europe. When in his famous speech at Clermont in November 1095, Pope Urban II exhorted the Christians to make war upon the, quote, wicked race that held the Holy Land, he enunciated, probably without knowing it himself, the charter of Western civilization. So this is a really important thing to understand, brothers and sisters, that, and for the non-Muslim Western people watching, embedded in the Western consciousness is that Western identity itself is birthed from distinguishing itself from Muslims and distinguishing itself from Muslims in a manner that is antagonistic to Muslims in the context of war. This is the base thing that binds Western and European identity together. The traumatic experience of the Crusades gave Europe its cultural awareness and its unity. But this same experience was destined henceforth also to provide the false color in which Islam was to appear to Western eyes. Not simply because the Crusades meant war and bloodshed. So many wars have been waged between nations and subsequently forgotten. And so many animosities, which in their time seemed ineradicable, have later turned into friendships. The damage caused by the Crusades was not restricted to a clash of weapons. It was, first and foremost, an intellectual damage, the poisoning of the Western mind against the Muslim world through a deliberate misrepresentation of the teachings and ideals of Islam. For if the call for a crusade was to maintain its validity, the prophet of the Muslims had, of necessity, to be stamped as the Antichrist, and his religion depicted in the most lurid terms as a fount of immorality and perversion. It was at the time of the Crusades that the ludicrous notion that Islam was a religion of crude sensualism and brutal violence, of an observance of ritual instead of a purification of the heart, entered the Western mind and remained there. And it was then that the name of the Prophet Muhammad, the same Muhammad who had insisted that his followers respect the prophets of other religions, was contemptuously transformed by Europeans into Mahound. The age when the spirit of independent inquiry could raise its head was as yet far distant in Europe. It was easy for the powers that were to sow the dark seeds of hatred for a religion and civilization that was so different from the religion and civilization of the West. Thus, it was no accident that the fiery Chanson de Roland, which describes the legendary victory of Christendom over the Muslim heathen in southern France, was composed not at the time of those battles, but 3 centuries later, to wit, shortly before the First Crusade, immediately to become a kind of national anthem of Europe. And Chanson de Roland is a famous poem in French literature that is often credited with birthing the major influence of French literature upon the rest of Europe. And he doesn't mention it here, but there is a similar parallel to be drawn with that and Dante's Inferno, which was a very influential piece of Italian literature upon the rest of Europe that was written later in the 14th century, which has an awful characterization of the Prophet Muhammad. And it is no accident either that this warlike epic marks the beginning of a European literature, as distinct from the earlier localized literatures, for hostility toward Islam stood over the cradle of European civilization. It would seem an irony of history that the age-old Western resentment against Islam, which was religious in origin, should still persist subconsciously at a time when religion has lost most of its hold on the imagination of Western man. This, however, is not really surprising. We know that a person may completely lose the religious beliefs imparted to him in his childhood while, nevertheless, some particular emotion connected with those beliefs remain, ironically, in force throughout his later life. And this, I conclude, is precisely what happened to that collective personality Western civilization. The shadow of the Crusades hovers over the West to this day, and all its reactions toward Islam and the Muslim world bear distinct traces of that die-hard ghost. So I've always found this part of Muhammad Asad's writing very interesting. Part of what I find interesting about it is I think he was able to so deftly conceptualize the Western mindset this way because of his exposure to Zionist discourse and the discourse amongst European Jews in general during his time as a young man in the 1920s. The discourse among Zionists was very interesting in the 1920s because the original Zionist thinkers, they were actually very, very secular people, and they were mostly socialists, especially Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book called The Jewish State, which is considered kind of the founding ideological document for the creation of the Zionist state that exists now. He was Austrian, like Muhammad Asad was. But he was also the first Zionist thinker to address the idea of what would happen to the native population if they created a Zionist state in Palestine. You know, these secular Jewish thinkers in Europe, they had a very strong sense of socialism from the influence of Marxism. They had a very strong sentiment of nationalism and their own lack of nationhood and their own lack of feeling secure in Europe. So that is how the idea for Zionism was developed. And when Herzl addressed the question of what would happen to the native population, it was kind of something that these secular socialists had avoided addressing because they had a strong concept and advocacy for the right of self-determination of a nation, and they wanted that for themselves, which they didn't have in Europe. Well, you know, how do you address the contradiction of the way that you want to go about having it is you want to take it away from someone else? And as a socialist, what Herzl actually theorized was if they went to Palestine to start a Jewish nation, that they could actually make the Arabs welcome it by bringing a better economic system that would benefit the Arabs economically. And of course, as socialists and Marxists, they thought of everything in materialist economic terms. Now, in the 1920s, after World War I and the British Mandate in Palestine and the Balfour Declaration, you started to have some explicit Arab resistance to the idea of Jewish immigration there. And so the Zionist discourse changes a little bit at that time, especially by the ideas of a Russian Zionist named Zeev Jabotinsky, who wrote an essay called The Iron Wall, where he basically says to these other Zionists who think that they can get some sort of consensual handover of the land from Arabs, like, you guys are stupid. And not only that, he actually says that they have an inappropriate contempt for Arabs by infantilizing them. And he says the Arabs aren't that way. They're actually a civilized people. They're not stupid. And they're like any other people who gets colonized, or they will be like any other people who gets colonized, that they are resistant to it. And they feel a connection to their land, and they will resist us if we colonize it. So he proposes that the only way to colonize the Palestine is to use very, very strong force, where there is an iron wall in between whatever Zionist state gets constructive and the native Arab population. And this guy was very influential on the right-wing Zionist movement, and eventually even the socialist Zionists, they came to adopt his way of thinking, and all the people ruling Israel right now, them and their predecessors, were very, very influenced by his thinking, and you can see it in the way that they deal with the Palestinians in the modern day. You know, the other thing is, it's in this time in the 1920s when you start having Zionist or Jewish-produced anti-Arab and anti-Muslim and anti-Islam propaganda produced. The history of Jews with that is way more limited than it is amongst Europeans themselves and Christian Europeans. And the reason that it started this time was Jabotinsky and the other thinkers like this, they were explicit that it was going to have to be British and European military power to put this iron wall up there. And they knew that if they could play on this long-held sentiment that Europeans had against Arabs and against Muslims, if they could inflame that would help move their cause along. So the anti-Muslim propaganda that has been produced by Zionists and Israelis is very, very well documented. You can read Orientalism by Edward Said. And also, too, if people are not familiar, the documentary and book Real Bad Arabs by Jack Sheehan, who was a Lebanese Christian, where he really shows the intertwine between Israeli producers in Hollywood and the United States military and the Department of Defense working together to produce film and movies, famous movies, that portrayed Arabs along all these patterns of stereotyping that have existed since the Crusades and that we're seeing prop up all over the place from certain outlets right now. So Zionist and Jewish anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic mental impulses and habits, they're not nearly as pathological and long held as it is amongst Christian Westerners or people who come from a Christian tradition. And the extent to which it exists amongst Jews and Zionists is really like a more utilitarian thing of trying to create Israel in the first place. So what does this mean? It means a few things. Number one, it's common when this conflict breaks out, and it should be more common for Muslims and people who, and even non-Muslim academics who are sympathetic to the Palestinians, to point out the long history that Jews have of living under Muslim rule and how they prospered under that rulership, and comparing that to the persecution that they often faced in Europe. And of course, there's a thing called Maghrebi Jews, or Jews in Morocco and North Africa, because Jews would often flee from Europe to North Africa when they would get kicked out of Europe. During the Nazi occupation of France, the Grand Central Mosque of Paris, which is the oldest masjid, the oldest mosque to exist in Europe outside of the Iberian Peninsula, that was a hiding place for Jews during the Nazi occupation of France. And even when Israel was first formed officially in 1948, there was hundreds of thousands of Maghrebi Jews, or Jews from North Africa, who went to Palestine to live in Israel. And many of them found that they had a harder time there, and some of them even wrote back home to family members saying, don't come here because these European Jews who are here, they are actually way more racist against us than the Arab Muslims are back home. So all of that history is very important. It is something people should be educated on when this issue breaks out. People can read the article How Islam Saved Jewry by David Wasserstein, which I'll put a link to in the pinned comment, as well as some links to some other books that talk about Jewish Arab and Jewish Muslim relations before the advent of the Zionist state that are written by Jews that attest to all this history. Now, the other thing I like to key in on about Muhammad Asad's conceptualization of the West here is I very, very much like the allegory of child development that he forms, and a European or Western collective identity forming alongside this trauma of the Crusades and the propaganda that the Catholic Church and the ruling class put upon them, the anti-Muslim and anti-Islam propaganda at that time. And if we think of that time as being their infancy, well, then where is Western civilization in its development now? I would say it's in its adolescence. What happens to someone during adolescence? Well, a lot happens with their identity. Oftentimes they go through an identity crisis. A lot of times in adolescence, someone is more willing to try out and experiment with different identities. Also, adolescence too is the time where a person is most likely to be open to rejecting what they were taught in their childhood, or to be interested in learning alternative perspectives from what they were taught in their childhood. Now, to my Muslim brothers and sisters, we are living in a unique historical period where there is more contact, communication, and integration between Muslims and people in the West than ever before. Many of you likely have ancestors who might have been persecuted by the colonization of the West or what have you, and maybe they wish that they had had the opportunity to be able to educate people in the West about Islam, but they did not have it. But Muslims nowadays do have the opportunity to educate people in the West unlike ever before. And those of us who can remember the period of the War on Terror, some of the propaganda that is flying around this week with the breakout in Palestine, like we're remembering, it's echoes of the type of stuff that was tossed around for years during then. And we should know and learn from that time period, what did all that propaganda flying around do to Muslims in many ways, especially Muslims in the West, of which they were less but have increased since and were increasing at that time. In many ways, it gave Muslims a feeling of paralyzation and certainly a fear. And that caused many Muslims to adopt the mental habit of wanting to stay isolated with their Muslim identity and teaching about Islam, feeling like that was the safe route to go. And then even only speaking about Islam in a way or with opportunities where it was felt that you were given permission by the Western power structures to do so. How did that manifest? Well, the West gave Muslims permission to say that Islam was a religion of peace. The West gave Muslims permission to say that Islam is a mosaic, not a monolith, or Islam is not a monolith. So you could talk about how diverse Muslims actually were, and you could say this line about Islam being a religion of peace. Those taglines, and they are actual taglines and like slogans, and sometimes you need slogans for the purposes of the way media works. But those were developed by Western think tanks. You can look up the Brookings Institute. They published a book called Islam, a Mosaic, Not a Monolith. I was studying Muslim politics at the time that they published that, and that book was passed around all of academia and taught in all these classes. And that has inculcated in people an idea of, well, if we're going to talk about Muslims, we're going to talk about Islam. What we really need to talk about is how diverse they are. And that's where you get this kind of habitual, not all Muslims are like that type of thinking. Now, of course, there is an extent to which that is true, that there is diversity amongst Muslims, absolutely, and that there is diversity within Islam to a certain degree. And of course, there is a large extent, Islam is a religion of peace, of course, but that got hammered so much that there's young people nowadays who they think the word Islam translates into peace, which of course it does not. And depending on slogans like that, and depending on what Western power structures give us permission for when it comes to talking about Islam, it pigeonholes us in a very, very intentional way. And it is a pigeonholing that is being done by people who, even if they themselves are well-intended, they are still victimized by this pathological trauma that anti-Islamic propaganda has done unto them over time, and that they don't quite know what to do about. So, brothers and sisters, this fear will take hold of many of you and many of us. The longer that this conflict goes on and the longer that this type of propaganda gets passed around. And I just say to, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only, and learn from the past so that we can strategize better on how to educate people better. How do we call people to platforms where they can listen and learn about Islam from A to Z and learn about it in a way in which things are put in the right place and it's not being done in reaction to some conflict where we're trying to undo a whole bunch of misconceptions and all that type of stuff before we start talking about it. That is what people really need. And if we think about the West being in its adolescence, and having and in a stage beyond its infancy and the trauma that went from then, we should understand that despite what we might see from propagandists, overall, people are very open and they are wanting to learn and willing to learn. And many of us have experienced, if we look beyond what we consume in media and we get beyond what media and consumption of media does to our minds, and we look at our actual interactions with people and the people we know, we can see that people are very open to learning about Islam and learning about what it really needs to be Muslim. And I think too, brothers and sisters, if you look at it, these elements of identity crisis, you can certainly see it taking place with Western civilization. And even though it can seem scary and harrowing to have people passing propaganda around and all this type of thing, and there's people who are still stuck in this kind of mental habit that has been conditioned into them, and they just jump on the bandwagon when it comes to denigrating Muslims in this way. And there might even be a sense among some of them who are still attached to like Western or American traditionalism. A lot of those types of people, they have been dismayed in the recent generation by coming to an awakening of just how lost Western civilization has gotten. And they might have this reaction right now where they're getting attached to this anti-Muslim narrative. But really, I think it is appropriate to see that almost more as like a dead cat bounce type of thing, as opposed to something that is really building up with a lot of fervor. Why? Because really it's not like that type of sentiment has been before, certainly not after 9/11. And even amongst that group of people, they are expressing this dismay over the fact that young people and people in college campuses are, being pro-Palestinian. And, why is that? It's because a lot of them, they've been exposed to new information that the mainstream media never gave them and still won't give them. And just in many ways too, people that they understand the lies that have been told to them. The West was really naive to that, and America especially is very naive to that. Even in recent history, just going back 10, 15, 20 years, that a lot has changed. So people are more open-minded than they used to be. Arming them with authentic knowledge about Islam is what will actually allow people to see through the propaganda and to actually allow them to heal from what the propaganda has done to their collective consciousness historically. And it is what will actually create freedom for Muslims and the freedom that enables them to really practice their religion in an authentic manner, which will only lead to good things for all of us, inshallah. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring an end to the violence that goes on everywhere in the world, really, as soon as He sees fits. I ask Him to protect our brothers and sisters in Palestine, especially in Gaza, and I ask Him to forgive us for all of our sins and shortcomings, and I ask Him to benefit from what was heard and said in this. Anything good that was said comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anything wrong that was said comes from the evils and deficiencies within my own soul. I ask Allah for forgiveness, and I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship but Him alone.